All right, welcome to part two of our biology of sex for STEM 118. So in that first part, we kind of gave an overview and talked about some definitions, which are going to be important, so don't hesitate to go back and review those. But now we're going to talk about the molecular determination of sex. So let's get into the biology of it. Now, ultimately, what this comes down to is what Darwin never knew. Huh. So Charles Darwin was one of he's a big name in evolution. He's the guy who came up with the theory of evolution, right? And we want to remember in science, a theory is something that is incredibly well established. We don't have laws in biology. And as we talked about in our investigation of the scientific method, we really can't prove anything. But we can accumulate evidence. And the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. Over the last 150 years, there has never really been a piece of evidence that contradicts our central idea of how evolution works, which is really, really powerful. We'll talk about that a little bit, but realize that that can be a lifetime of study. But what Darwin didn't know was DNA. So he's working 100 years before we discovered the double helix. And with the understanding of the structure of DNA, it allowed us to really crack open its mechanism. And that has opened up the world for us in the last 50, 60 years now. So what we want to think about is some of the understanding that has arisen more recently in evolution, and this is the idea of genetic switches. So here's the link. You can pull it from the PowerPoint on the website, or I'll put it separately. If you want to start around 46 minutes and watch it for about 7 minutes or so. If you do that, you're going to get a really great story about how two different flies can have the same genes but appear differently, significantly different, have a very different phenotype, even though the DNA is the same. How does that work? Well, ultimately, it's going to work based on the idea of switches, right? So you can have information to build something biologically, or in any case, physically, but if you don't kind of turn on the information to be processed, it doesn't get built, right? And that's what really is going to be the highlight of the molecular mechanism for development of male or female. So really, these gene switches that are turned on very early in development are going to have a role in that. So gene switches are genes, and so if you go back to our lecture on the basics of molecular biology and gene expression, we want to remember that a gene is a segment of the DNA that contains a sequence of A's, T's, G's, and C's, and those A's, T's, G's, and C's are in a sequence that is information to build a protein. Now, again, if you've taken my 160 class, you know that proteins do stuff, right? Like they are getting in there and doing the chemistry of life. Now, one thing that we haven't really emphasized is this idea that a protein, which can be enzymatic, can be structural, is doing stuff. One of the things that it can do is turn other genes on or off. And as soon as you have a gene that its product, the protein that it makes, turns other genes on and off, you can start to build genetic circuits, right? So just like on a circuit board, you can have electricity flowing through different components, taking different pathways. You can have information flowing through different genes as certain genes are turned off and on in response to other genes, right? So that's pretty cool stuff. And so what we found was the SRY gene, right? So this is the region on the Y chromosome that really is kind of the first big switch to say, hey, we're going male. And that's why historically we've seen males with XY chromosomes. If you didn't have the Y chromosome, you didn't have this big switch that said, okay, now we're going to go down the developmental pathway to make a male. Now, the thing about the Y chromosome that's really interesting is that it's not a very big chromosome at all. In fact, it's the smallest chromosome of all the chromosomes, and it doesn't have that many genes on it. So what that suggests, and which is absolutely true, is that the genes to build a male, all the male parts and that male phenotype are spread out over all your chromosomes, right? The same is true for female. So when you get sent down the pathway to become male, if you have that SRY gene initially activated, There's other genes that are involved in saying, okay, we're going to go down this pathway now. If you don't have the SRY gene, the default is to go down the pathway to develop female. And there's another DMRT1 genes are the genes that say, hey, we're going to go down the pathway, we're going to stay on that pathway. Now, what I want to show you are these diagrams that start to map out the interaction between different genes that are all involved in the phenotypic development of male or female, sexual development, right? And they can get pretty complicated. So if you look at some of those genes like the DMRT1 gene in Homo sapiens, it's touching a lot of different stuff. So it's the red one down kind of in the center there. It's touching a lot of stuff, which is touching a lot of stuff, which is touching a lot of stuff. Every one of those interactions is up for grabs, for change, right? We get a mutation in a gene, which is just a change in the sequence, which changes the protein maybe a little bit. And it may have no impact, but it may say, oh, you know what? When I have this connection to other genes, it's a little bit stronger. Or it's a little bit worse, like it's not as strong. Or it's not there at all. Or I'm going to make a connection to a different gene that I didn't make a connection to before, right? And so when we look at these, and this is the SRY binding motif, so this is physically how this protein can interact with other proteins, we can see that these have a lot of different points of control in that developmental pathway. Every one of these points is actually, it's a switch, but a switch isn't the best analogy. Kind of a dial is really the best analogy. Because though many genes can be just on or off, there's just as many genes out there that you can dial up or dial down. So now all of a sudden, you can have small mutations in a gene that affect how much it turns on a couple other genes downstream, which affects how they turn on other genes. And all of a sudden, the idea of a spectrum of two pathways really becomes traveling down one pathway many different ways, traveling down the other pathway many different ways, right? Creating a system of circuits that, depending on how information flows through them, you could be anywhere from one extreme that we call female to the other extreme that we call male. And hence, intersex is absolutely found in nature because this is how it works. All right. So we also think of sex, male or female, as something that's kind of set. And for humans, this does initiate very early in development because there's a lot of stuff that has to happen, right? And, you know, we're built like we are. This is how our species is. But here's another species that does things a little bit different. We're going to go down this pathway now, which gets really interesting. The blue-headed wrasse. Now, if you listen to the Radio Lab XY, it really will talk about these switches and these genes. It's worth that. If you're going to do one resource from this particular topic, that's the one to do. So good. But it will talk about these fish. Now, what you have here is what looks like a beautiful fish, and then maybe a little baby fish next to it. Well, in fact, that's a male and a female, right? And so what we're going to introduce here, and we're going to talk about a little bit more in just a couple minutes, is sexual dimorphism. And that is how the two sexes look differently. We'll get there. But what I want to point out here is with the blue-headed wrasse, the way they organize their social interactions is you have one male fish with a bunch of females. So it has a harem. Now, that's how it reproduces. So he produces the sperm, a bunch of different eggs. You get baby fish. You're moving forward as a species. If something happens to the male, what's up? Are all those females now never going to be able to reproduce? Nope. So now you have the harem, and there's a hierarchy in the harem. So the kind of dominant, the lead female, will become male and then take over. And if they lose that male, then another female will become a male and take over. So there's plasticity there that we don't see in humans. And in nature, we see this a lot. So there are a lot of different ways to determine sex. And male and female are kind of limited terms. I like to think more of those individuals that have sufficient phenotype to produce sperm and those individuals that have sufficient phenotype to produce eggs, right? You have to have the right machinery, right? Like your cells have to be set up, you have to have the organs in place. But again, you have a whole spectrum moving from one end to the other. You're going to get to a point where someone's in the middle that they may or may not be able to produce either gamete, but you've got everything going on. So when we think about producing sperm producers or egg producers, we actually have a whole lot of different ways to determine that in nature. People oftentimes become very human-centric, and there's nothing wrong with that. Especially as we study biology, we want to think about, oh, well, how does this apply to me? But at the same time, what we don't want to do is apply the model that we've evolved in to the rest of the world, right? So when we look at this, we can see that here in the middle there, you see genotypic sex determination, you see male heterogamety. That's the XY. That's us. Well, there's also ZW that we see in chickens, right? There is temperature-dependent environmental sex determination. So in many reptiles, sea turtles are one example. And there's a paper that just came out recently on looking at the exact mechanism of how this works, which I haven't read yet, which I'm really excited to read, is when turtles lay eggs in the sand, they have all their eggs in a nest. Some of those eggs will develop as male and some will develop as female. But what determines that is their distance from the center of the nest, because the outer edges of the nest are going to be cooler and they will develop as male. And the inner parts of the nest are going to be maintained warmer, and they will develop as female. So the temperature at which that developing embryo is kept will determine its sex. Why? Because all the genes that we need to make a male turtle are in there, as well as all the genes that we need to make a female turtle. Just like in humans, all the genes that are necessary to make me a female are in me. Just like females, all the genes to make a male are in them. It happened to be that I got a Y chromosome and the switch was flipped to turn on the genes that give me a male phenotype, a sperm producer, right? And that people sometimes freak out when they hear that. It's like, whoa, and that's what they talk about in the podcast, which is really fun. It's like, there's an inner Marcy, right? I happen to be Mark, but I could be Marcy, you know? All the information is there. So this is also interesting when you think about the turtles. Back to the turtles, the temperature. With global warming, we've seen a reduction in the number of males, right? Because if that egg doesn't get cool enough because the temperatures are warmer, then we may lose a species in a generation. Because if you don't have any males, then you can't reproduce, right? So lots of different mechanisms, very interesting stuff, huge topic of research if it's something that you want to follow up on. Just a chart again to show you that this extends even into the plant world, right? And again, something that some people, if you haven't studied biology, you may not realize that there are many plants out there that are both male and female. Some plants are just male, some plants are just female. Some plants go through a stage where they're male, some plants go through a stage where they're female. And that's not something that people think about, but that is sexual reproduction, right? And so we can see that there are lots of different ways to do this. So we always want to think about the diversity that we see in nature, right? That's really a strength. So kind of thinking about this section now, we hear it often, and that is that when people will argue that there are only two sexes because that's the biology of things, I hope that you could take a few minutes now as we end this video and think to yourself, I can respond to that now with some valid arguments, all right? All right, thanks everybody. I'll catch you in the third part of this series in just a few minutes.